Why control works better when it feels optional. Control is most effective when it does not announce itself as control, when it arrives disguised as freedom, flexibility, or personal choice, and when those living inside it believe they are acting independently rather than responding to invisible constraints. For most of history, power relied on enforcement. Rules were explicit. Consequences were visible. Obedience was demanded and measured. But that model has a flaw. The moment control is obvious, resistance begins organizing around it. In the modern world, where authority is questioned instantly and legitimacy erodes under scrutiny, overt control has become inefficient, expensive, and dangerously unstable. People no longer submit quietly. They analyze, challenge, document, and coordinate. This forced power to evolve. Among elite sheiks, control stopped looking like restriction and started behaving like opportunity. Instead of closing doors, it offered corridors. Instead of saying no, it presented limited yes. Instead of enforcing compliance, it shaped preference. To understand why this works so well today, we need to examine psychology rather than politics. People resist force, but they defend choice. They rebel against commands, but rationalize constraints they believe they selected themselves. This is a core insight. When control feels optional, it bypasses the instinct to fight. When boundaries feel self-imposed, they are maintained voluntarily. And when outcomes feel chosen, they are protected emotionally. The sheiks observed this pattern across societies, markets, and institutions. They saw how rigid authority collapsed under pressure, while flexible systems endured without confrontation. Control moved upstream. Instead of regulating behavior directly, it regulated environments. Instead of dictating decisions, it structured incentives. Instead of enforcing limits, it framed possibilities. Nothing appeared forced. Everything appeared reasonable. Access required alignment, but alignment felt beneficial. Progress depended on compliance, but compliance felt strategic. Limits existed, but they appeared situational rather than absolute. This subtlety changed everything. People stopped asking who was in control. They started asking how to optimize within the system. That is the moment control becomes invisible. And invisible control is far stronger than visible authority because it does not provoke rebellion, it does not create martyrs, and it does not generate clear targets for opposition. But this approach carries a hidden risk. If control becomes too subtle, it can be mistaken for weakness. If options appear too open, boundaries may be tested. And if choice feels unlimited, authority can dissolve entirely. The balance is delicate. Control must feel optional, but outcomes must remain consistent. That tension sits at the heart of modern power. And in a world where everyone claims to value freedom, the systems that control best are the ones that never seem to control at all. How that balance is maintained and what happens when it fails reveals why optional control has become the preferred strategy of those who cannot afford resistance. Optional control only works when the illusion of choice is carefully maintained, because the moment people sense that outcomes are predetermined, the psychological contract collapses and resistance quietly re-enters the system. This is why power invests more effort in shaping pathways and enforcing endpoints. Instead of forcing decisions, it curates options. Instead of blocking alternatives, it makes them costly, slow, or socially inconvenient. And instead of denying access, it conditions it. The sheiks refine this technique by observing how people respond to freedom under constraint. When individuals believe multiple paths are available, they stop questioning who designed the map. They focus on optimizing their movement instead of challenging the structure itself. Control becomes background noise. In these systems, permission is never denied outright. It is delayed, redirected, or wrapped in requirements that feel reasonable but accumulate quietly. Each requirement appears fair in isolation. Together, they narrow outcomes dramatically. This fragmentation is intentional. People do not rebel against a single small barrier. They adapt to it, and adaptation, repeated enough times, becomes acceptance. Optional control also redistributes responsibility. When outcomes disappoint, individuals blame their choices rather than the system. Failure feels personal. Success feels earned. This emotional transfer is critical. The system remains unquestioned while participants self-correct their behavior to align with its logic. Control no longer needs to intervene. People enforce it on themselves. However, optional control demands constant calibration. Too much freedom, and the system loses coherence. Too little, and the illusion breaks. The sheiks learned to monitor tension carefully. When resistance threatened to surface, flexibility increased. When alignment drifted, options quietly narrowed again. This elasticity preserved stability. From the outside, the system appeared permissive. From the inside, it was directional. But this model faced a new challenge. As people became more sophisticated, they began noticing patterns. They sensed that freedom always seemed to resolve the same way. And once that realization forms, optional control must evolve again, because awareness, even without rebellion, changes behavior. The next phase would determine whether control could remain invisible. Once it was partially understood, the conflict intensifies the moment people begin to sense that their freedom consistently leads them to the same destinations. Because even without open rebellion, awareness alone subtly changes how individuals relate to the system guiding them. At this stage, optional control becomes fragile. People may not resist openly, but they hesitate internally. They slow down. They test alternatives. They begin looking for exits rather than optimizations. This is dangerous for power, because optional control depends on participation, not obedience. And participation weakens the moment choice feels cosmetic rather than real. The sheiks noticed this shift long before it became visible. They saw it in slowed engagement, in quiet skepticism, in subtle attempts to bypass established pathways. The illusion was thinning. When participants feel guided too precisely, they stop trusting the map. They start questioning intent instead of outcome. This is where many systems fail. They respond by tightening control, by reducing flexibility, by clarifying authority. But clarification exposes the very structure optional control is designed to hide. So the strategy evolved again. Instead of narrowing options further, the system expanded them superficially. New paths appeared. New frameworks emerged. New initiatives promised differentiation. But beneath the surface, convergence remained intact. This reintroduced uncertainty. People could no longer tell whether outcomes were predetermined or merely likely. That ambiguity restored engagement when certainty disappears. Curiosity replaces suspicion. Exploration replaces resistance. Optional control thrives in ambiguity. The sheiks also learned to introduce randomness strategically, not chaos, but variation. Some participants advanced unexpectedly. Others stalled without clear reason. Exceptions appeared without explanation. This disrupted pattern recognition. When systems become unreadable, they become harder to oppose, because opposition requires clarity, and clarity was intentionally withheld. However, this approach carried a serious risk. Too much ambiguity can feel unfair. Too much variation can feel arbitrary, and arbitrariness erodes legitimacy faster than force. The balance narrowed further. Control had to feel optional, but also just, flexible, but not chaotic. Maintaining that balance required constant adjustment, continuous sensing, and a willingness to redesign quietly rather than defend publicly. The sheiks understood that optional control is not a structure, it is a process, and processes must evolve, or they collapse under awareness. The system was holding, but pressure was building, because once people stopped believing in choice, even the illusion of freedom is no longer enough. The next phase would force control, to reveal whether it could survive. Without belief at all, the climax arrives when belief is no longer required. At this stage, control no longer depends on whether people feel free, manipulated, or aware of the structure guiding them, because the system has matured enough to function even without emotional buy-in. This is the final evolution of optional control. The sheiks did not attempt to restore belief. They replaced it with inevitability. Instead of relying on participation, the system aligned incentives so thoroughly that deviation became impractical rather than forbidden. People could choose differently, but the cost of doing so became obvious, slow, and unrewarding. This was the breakthrough. Control stopped asking for agreement. It stopped needing consent. It stopped requiring illusion. Choice remained visible, but consequence became structural. Those who followed the intended paths moved smoothly. Those who resisted encountered friction everywhere. Not punishment, not denial, just inefficiency. This removed emotional resistance entirely. There was nothing to fight, nothing to expose, nothing to protest. The system did not argue. It did not justify itself. It simply worked. That was the revelation. The strongest form of control is not psychological. It is logistical. When systems are designed so that alignment feels natural and resistance feels exhausting, behavior converges automatically. Optional control completed its transformation. It no longer needed belief because it no longer relied on perception. It relied on structure. The resolution is unsettling. At this level, freedom still exists, but it no longer changes outcomes. People remain free to choose, yet outcomes remain consistent, not because power enforces them, but because the environment makes alternatives unsustainable. This is why modern control rarely looks authoritarian. It looks functional, efficient, neutral, and neutrality disarms opposition more effectively than force ever could. Optional control does not conquer, it absorbs. It does not suppress difference, it routes around it. And once control reaches this stage, it becomes almost invisible again. Not because people believe in it, but because they no longer need to. They simply move within it. And that is why control works best, when it feels optional. Why